The loudest applause I have ever heard came just before the quietest decision of my life. My name is Daniel Brooks, and until that evening, I believed I understood exactly who I was going to marry. Emily Carter and I had been engaged for 8 months. We had spent nearly 2 years building a relationship that felt steady, respectful, and honest. We talked about buying our first home together, taking road trips through the national parks, and one day raising a family built on trust rather than perfection. That Friday evening, she invited me to celebrate what she called a special milestone. She refused to tell me what we were celebrating, only saying that I should wear my favorite navy blazer because the restaurant had a business casual dress code. I smiled all afternoon, convinced she had planned a surprise connected to our upcoming wedding. The restaurant overlooked the Chicago River, with warm lighting reflecting across the water as people enjoyed quiet conversations over elegant dinners. A perfectly cooked ribeye steak cost $90 before tax, making it the kind of place reserved for birthdays, anniversaries, or life-changing moments. When I arrived, Emily greeted me with a warm hug and introduced me to several of her closest friends who were already seated around a large table. I was surprised because I thought the evening would be just the two of us, but I quickly convinced myself she wanted everyone to celebrate together. Laughter filled the table. Glasses were raised for a toast. Stories from our relationship became entertainment for the group. Emily looked genuinely happy, and seeing her smile made me forget my earlier confusion. Dinner arrived, and everything felt surprisingly normal. We talked about wedding venues, honeymoon ideas, and whether we preferred a mountain cabin or a beach resort for our first vacation as husband and wife. I noticed one unfamiliar woman sitting at a nearby table. She occasionally looked toward our group before returning to her meal. I assumed she was simply another customer enjoying her evening. Looking back now, I realized that first impression could not have been more wrong. As dessert menus were placed on the table, Emily stood and gently tapped her glass with a spoon. The conversation stopped almost immediately. She smiled at everyone before turning toward me. "Daniel," she said, "before we take the next step in our lives together, there is one important thing I would like us to do tonight." I smiled back, expecting a heartfelt speech or perhaps another wedding surprise. Instead, she reached into her designer handbag and carefully removed a thick leather folder. She placed it directly in front of me with both hands. "I want us to sign a prenuptial agreement," she said calmly. Before I could respond, several of her friends began applauding. At first, I honestly thought it was a joke. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to laugh or explain that this was part of some elaborate prank. Nobody laughed. Everyone continued smiling as though they had rehearsed the moment together. My eyes returned to Emily. She looked hopeful rather than hostile, almost as if she expected me to appreciate the surprise. I slowly placed my hand on the folder without opening it. "Emily," I said quietly, "I wish we had talked about something this important before tonight." She nodded once. "I know this is unexpected, but I think it is the right time." Before I could ask another question, the unfamiliar woman from the nearby table stood, picked up a leather briefcase, and calmly walked toward us. She carried herself with quiet confidence and offered Emily a professional smile before looking at me. "Good evening, Mr. Brooks," she said politely. "My name is Rebecca Hayes." She extended her hand. "I represent Emily regarding the agreement in front of you." The applause faded into complete silence. Every person at the table watched my reaction. I looked from the leather folder to the attorney standing beside my chair, then back to Emily. For the first time that evening, I realized this dinner had never been a celebration at all. It had been carefully planned from the very beginning. Yet as I met Rebecca's eyes, I noticed something unexpected. Out of everyone gathered around that expensive table, she was the only person who was not smiling. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The restaurant, which had felt warm and inviting only moments earlier, suddenly seemed unusually quiet despite the conversations taking place at nearby tables. I looked at the leather folder resting in front of me, then at Rebecca Hayes, who remained standing beside Emily with a calm, professional expression. Unlike everyone else, she was not celebrating. She simply waited. That detail immediately caught my attention. People who expected an easy signature usually smiled. Lawyers who anticipated difficult conversations often remained careful with every word. I slowly stood from my chair and shook Rebecca's hand. "It is nice to meet you," I said politely. "Thank you for being here." She nodded. "Likewise, Mr. Brooks." I then turned toward Emily. Would you mind if I asked a few questions before opening the agreement? Emily smiled with visible confidence. Of course. That is exactly why Rebecca is here. One of her friends laughed softly. Daniel, it is just paperwork. Everybody should have one these days. Another immediately added, you will probably sign it in 5 minutes. Their comments were followed by several approving nods around the table. I listened without responding. Instead, I carefully pulled the leather folder closer, but still did not open it. I had negotiated business contracts before. I knew that signing anything without understanding it was never wise, regardless of who presented it. Emily, I asked quietly, when did you decide to prepare this? She hesitated only briefly. A few months ago. A few months. I repeated, yes. And you never thought we should discuss it together before tonight? Her smile became smaller. I wanted everything professionally prepared before bringing it to you. I nodded slowly. So everyone here already knew except me? No one answered immediately. The silence itself became the answer. I looked around the table. Jessica Miller, Emily's closest friend, avoided eye contact for the first time that evening. Another couple suddenly became interested in their water glasses. The atmosphere had changed. What had started as confident celebration now felt uncertain. Rebecca finally spoke. Mr. Brooks, if I may. I looked toward her. Please. No attorney should ever expect someone to sign a prenuptial agreement immediately after receiving it. My role is to explain the document and answer questions, not to pressure anyone into making a decision tonight. Her words surprised nearly everyone at the table. Emily blinked in confusion. Rebecca, I thought. The attorney gently interrupted. Emily, I explained during our meetings that both parties should have adequate time to review any agreement independently. That protects everyone involved. I noticed Jessica shifting uncomfortably in her seat. The confidence surrounding the dinner continued to fade. Emily looked back at me. I was not trying to pressure you. Her voice sounded sincere. I honestly thought this would show that we were both entering marriage with complete clarity. I believed she meant those words, but something still did not feel right. Clarity usually begins with conversation, I answered calmly. Not with surprises. She lowered her eyes for a moment. I finally opened the folder. The first page contained both of our names, the date, and several legal notices explaining that each party had the opportunity to obtain independent legal counsel before signing. I continued reading silently while everyone around the table waited. The document looked professionally prepared. Nothing appeared aggressive or disrespectful at first glance. There were sections describing separate property owned before marriage, future inheritance rights, financial disclosure requirements, and procedures for revising the agreement if both spouses consented later. Everything seemed orderly. Everything seemed reasonable. Then I reached a section that made me stop reading. I looked up toward Rebecca instead of Emily. She noticed exactly where my eyes had paused on the page. Without saying anything else, she quietly pulled out a chair and sat down across from me. Her expression became noticeably more serious. At that moment, I realized she had been waiting for someone to notice the same paragraph that had just caught my attention. Rebecca folded her hands on the table and looked directly at me. You stopped on section 9, she said in a calm voice. Most people do not. I glanced back at the document before answering. Because that section changes more than financial protection. It changes decision-making inside the marriage. Emily looked confused. What do you mean? I slowly turned the agreement so everyone at the table could see the page without pushing it toward them. This paragraph states that any business or investment I build after our marriage would automatically remain separate property unless both parties agree otherwise. That part is common enough. The next paragraph is what concerns me. Rebecca nodded slightly, but remained silent. I continued reading aloud. It also requires that any financial disagreement involving future jointly purchased assets be resolved through binding arbitration selected by a law firm listed in this agreement. I looked up. That law firm is yours. Emily blinked in surprise before turning toward Rebecca. I did not realize that was included. Rebecca answered honestly. It was included in the standard draft prepared by my office. It is often revised or removed during negotiations. Emily looked genuinely unsettled. Negotiations? Rebecca gave a small, professional smile. A prenuptial agreement is rarely a final document on the first draft. It is usually the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. The confidence around the table continued to disappear. Jessica quietly set down her fork and looked toward Emily. I thought everything was already finished. Emily slowly shook her head. So did I. I closed the folder without any sign of frustration. Emily, may I ask you something that has nothing to do with legal language? Of course. When you imagined tonight, what did you believe would happen? She hesitated before answering. I thought you would read it, ask a few questions, and then we would celebrate because everything would be clear before the wedding. Did you ever imagine I might feel blindsided? Her shoulders lowered slightly. Honestly, no. I was thinking about avoiding future misunderstandings. I never stopped to think that the surprise itself might become the misunderstanding. Her answer sounded sincere rather than defensive. That mattered to me. I remembered the first time we talked about marriage nearly a year earlier while walking along the lakefront after dinner. Emily had told me she admired couples who solved difficult problems together instead of pretending they did not exist. That memory made tonight feel even more complicated. The intention behind her actions did not seem cruel, yet the way she carried them out had quietly damaged the trust she hoped to protect. Rebecca gently cleared her throat. Mr. Brooks, may I offer one observation? I nodded. Please. During my career, I have prepared many agreements. The healthiest couples usually ask the most questions. They do not sign quickly because they value the relationship more than the paperwork. Her words settled over the table. Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. Even Emily's friends seemed to recognize that the evening had taken a direction none of them expected. I looked at Emily and smiled gently. I am not offended that you want a prenuptial agreement. She looked surprised. You are not. No. Two adults can responsibly discuss financial expectations before marriage. What hurts is discovering that everyone else knew about the conversation long before I did. Her eyes filled with quiet regret. You are right. She reached across the table but stopped just short of touching my hand. I should have trusted you enough to start the conversation instead of planning the presentation. Rebecca looked from Emily to me before carefully closing her own notebook. If I may make one recommendation, she said. I think this discussion has moved beyond legal drafting. I believe the three of us would accomplish far more if we continued somewhere quieter, without an audience. For the first time that evening, every person sitting around the table realized the celebration they had expected was over. One by one, Emily's friends exchanged uncertain looks, and Jessica quietly stood from her chair. Without anyone asking, she softly said, Maybe we should give you both some privacy. Within a few minutes, the laughter that had filled the private dining room completely disappeared. Jessica quietly thanked the restaurant staff before leading the rest of the group toward the exit. One by one, Emily's friends offered awkward smiles, wished us the best, and left without another word. No one tried to defend what had happened. No one attempted to convince me to sign the agreement anymore. Soon, only 3 people remained at the table: Emily, Rebecca, and me. The expensive steaks had long since gone cold. Half-finished glasses of sparkling water reflected the warm lights hanging above us. Outside the large windows, the Chicago River continued flowing as though nothing unusual had happened. Rebecca carefully placed her leather briefcase on the floor beside her chair. Thank you, she said quietly after the others had gone. Emily looked confused. For what? Rebecca answered without hesitation. For slowing this evening down before anyone made a decision they might later regret. Emily folded her hands together. I honestly believed everything was ready. Rebecca gave her a compassionate smile. That is understandable. Legal documents often appear complete because they are professionally written, but a strong agreement is never created by one person preparing it alone. It becomes meaningful only when both people shape it together. I listened carefully. Her words sounded less like legal advice and more like relationship advice. I finally spoke. Rebecca, can I ask you something? Of course. When Emily first contacted you, what impression did you have? Rebecca paused before answering. I believed she genuinely wanted to protect both of you. She never described this as a contest or an attempt to gain an advantage. She repeatedly said she wanted your future marriage to begin with complete honesty about finances. Emily slowly lowered her eyes. The problem is that I forgot honesty begins before the paperwork. Rebecca nodded gently. Exactly. I looked toward Emily. Can you tell me what made you think about a prenuptial agreement in the first place? She took a long breath before speaking. I have never told you everything about my parents' divorce. That answer immediately caught my attention. During our relationship, Emily rarely discussed her childhood beyond a few brief stories. She had once mentioned that the divorce had been difficult, but she always changed the subject afterward. Tonight was different. After they separated, she continued quietly. They spent years arguing about property, retirement accounts, family savings, and responsibilities that should have been discussed long before they married. I watched two people who once loved each other slowly become strangers because every conversation turned into another legal argument. She looked directly at me for the first time in several minutes. I promised myself I would never repeat their mistakes. I nodded slowly. That explains why you wanted an agreement. Yes. Her voice trembled slightly. But somewhere along the way I became so focused on preventing future conflict that I accidentally created conflict before our marriage even began. The honesty in her words made the entire evening feel different. Until that moment, I had been trying to understand the document. Now I finally understood the fear behind it. Rebecca quietly opened her notebook and removed several pages from the original draft. May I show you something? We both agreed. She placed two nearly identical versions of the agreement side by side. This is the first draft Emily reviewed, she explained. This second version includes my own notes after our last meeting. Several sections are highlighted because I recommended discussing them together before anyone signed anything. I noticed handwritten comments beside multiple paragraphs. Discuss together. Consider separate counsel. Revise jointly. Confirm mutual understanding. I looked at Rebecca with surprise. You expected changes. She smiled. I always expect changes. Every healthy couple changes the first draft. Emily stared silently at those handwritten notes. You told me not to rush. Rebecca nodded. More than once. Emily sighed deeply before looking back at me. I was afraid that if I waited too long, I would lose the courage to bring it up. I gently closed the folder and slid it back across the table. Then maybe tonight was never supposed to be about signing anything. Emily tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? I smiled for the first time since arriving at the restaurant. Maybe tonight was supposed to be the first real conversation we should have started months ago. Rebecca quietly leaned back in her chair, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Rebecca gathered the marked pages into a neat stack, but left the original agreement in front of us. There is one more reason I hoped you would not sign this tonight, she said calmly. Emily and I looked at her at the same time. Every prenuptial agreement should reflect the values of the couple, not simply legal language. Right now, this document reflects preparation. It does not yet reflect partnership. Those words lingered in the quiet room. I looked down at the agreement again, but instead of seeing legal clauses, I saw two different people trying to protect the future in completely different ways. Emily feared uncertainty because she had watched her parents lose themselves in years of painful legal disputes. I feared secrecy because I believed trust could only exist when difficult conversations happened openly. Neither of us wanted to hurt the other. We had simply chosen opposite paths toward the same goal. Would you tell me something honestly? I asked Emily. She nodded immediately. Always. If I had been the one who arranged this dinner, invited my friends, hired an attorney without telling you, and placed a legal agreement in front of you while everyone watched, how would you have felt? She did not answer right away. Instead, she slowly turned toward the large windows overlooking the river before whispering. I would have felt embarrassed. After another pause, she added, and I probably would have wondered whether you still trusted me. I gently nodded. That is exactly how I felt when you placed the folder on the table. She closed her eyes briefly. I understand now. Rebecca remained silent, allowing us to continue. Emily reached into her handbag and removed a folded sheet of paper. There is something else I need to show you. She unfolded it carefully before sliding it toward me. It was not another legal document. It was a handwritten list titled Wedding Priorities. I recognized several items immediately because we had discussed them together months earlier. Spend within our budget. Keep both families involved. Donate leftover flowers to a local hospital. Create a college savings account for future children before buying luxury items. I smiled faintly as I continued reading. Every line reminded me of the woman I had fallen in love with. Near the bottom of the page, however, another sentence caught my attention. Protect each other from unnecessary pain, even if the conversation is difficult. I looked back at Emily. You wrote this? She nodded. The night after we became engaged. I held the paper for a few seconds before placing it beside the agreement. This list sounds much more like us than that contract does. A small smile finally appeared on her face. I thought the same thing after tonight began. Rebecca quietly leaned forward. May I make another suggestion? We both agreed. Take this agreement home. Do not think of it as something to sign. Think of it as the first draft of a conversation. If you decide you still want a prenuptial agreement, create one together. If you decide you do not, that should also be a mutual decision. Either way, the process matters more than the paperwork. I appreciated the simplicity of her advice. It was the first time all evening that the agreement no longer felt like a test. It felt like a choice. The server approached our table with remarkable courtesy. Would anyone like dessert this evening? All three of us smiled politely before declining. Once he walked away, Emily quietly laughed for the first time since the folder appeared. I cannot believe I planned this entire evening down to the minute and completely forgot the most important part. I tilted my head. What was that? She looked directly into my eyes, asking how you felt before assuming I already knew the answer. I reached across the table and gently took her hand. That is a mistake both of us can learn from. Rebecca slowly closed her notebook and stood. I think my work for tonight is finished. Before leaving, she placed her business card beside the folder. When you are ready, call me. Not because you need signatures, but because every lasting agreement deserves two voices instead of one. As she walked toward the restaurant entrance, I watched her disappear into the evening crowd. Then I looked back at Emily, realizing the most important decision of the night had never been whether to sign a contract. It was whether we were willing to rebuild our next conversation on honesty instead of assumptions. When we stepped outside the restaurant, the cool evening air felt completely different from the atmosphere we had just left behind. The sounds of traffic blended with the gentle movement of the Chicago River, and for the first time all night, neither of us felt pressured to make an immediate decision. Emily walked beside me in silence, carrying the leather folder under one arm. After several minutes, she finally spoke. Would you like to go home? I smiled softly. Not yet. She looked at me with quiet uncertainty. Then where? I pointed toward the river walk just across the street. There. I think we should have one conversation without documents sitting between us. She nodded immediately. We found an empty bench overlooking the water, where the city lights reflected across the surface in long, shimmering lines. People passed by enjoying the evening, completely unaware that our future had nearly been rewritten inside a private dining room only minutes earlier. Emily folded her hands together and looked out at the skyline. Do you remember our first date? She asked. I laughed quietly. You ordered the cheapest thing on the menu because you thought I was trying too hard to impress you. She smiled for the first time in what felt like hours. I was convinced you would never ask me out again after that. Instead, I spent the entire drive home hoping you would agree to a second date. The memory eased the tension between us. It reminded me that before legal language, before wedding planning, before difficult conversations about money, there had simply been two people learning to trust each other one honest conversation at a time. Emily took a slow breath. Can I tell you something I have never admitted out loud? Always. She turned toward me. When my parents divorced, everyone kept saying the same sentence. They said the arguments were about money. But years later, I realized they were never really arguing about money. They were arguing because they stopped believing the other person would tell the whole truth. Her words stayed with me. I promised myself I would never let fear decide the future of our marriage, she continued. Ironically, fear was exactly what guided me into planning tonight. I reached down, picked up a small pebble from the edge of the walkway, and gently tossed it into the river. Fear has a strange way of pretending it is wisdom. She slowly nodded, and I listened to it. We sat quietly for another minute before I asked the question that had been on my mind since dinner began. Emily, if we had talked about a prenuptial agreement over coffee 6 months ago instead of tonight, do you think this conversation would feel different? She answered without hesitation. Completely different. Why? Because you would have been my partner in the conversation instead of the audience for a surprise. That answer meant more to me than she probably realized. I had never objected to discussing finances responsibly. I had objected to becoming the last person invited into a conversation about my own future. Emily carefully opened the leather folder again, but instead of handing it to me, she removed the entire agreement and slowly folded it closed. I do not want this version anymore, she said. Not because every clause is wrong, but because it was created before we actually listened to each other. I watched her place the agreement back inside the folder. Then what do you want? She smiled gently. I want us to start over. I looked at the river before answering. Starting over does not mean pretending tonight never happened. I know. It means learning something valuable enough that tonight was worth surviving. She quietly slipped her hand into mine. Do you think we can do that? I looked at her and saw the same woman who had once believed love was built through careful planning, now realizing it was strengthened by honest conversation instead. Yes, I answered sincerely. But only if every difficult subject from now on reaches this bench before it reaches another lawyer's office. Emily laughed softly through the emotion in her voice. That sounds like the healthiest agreement we have made all evening. As we stood to leave, I noticed the leather folder remained closed under her arm. Neither of us reached for it again because, for the first time that night, the most important document between us was no longer written on paper. It was the quiet promise that every future decision would begin with a conversation instead of a surprise. The following morning, sunlight filtered through our apartment windows long before either of us said much. The leather folder rested on the kitchen counter exactly where Emily had placed it after we returned home, untouched since the night before. It no longer felt like an urgent problem waiting to be solved. Instead, it had become a reminder that some decisions deserve patience rather than speed. Emily set 2 mugs of coffee on the table and smiled nervously. I have been thinking all night, she admitted. So have I replied. We sat together without opening the folder. For the first time since the engagement, neither of us was trying to convince the other of anything. We were simply trying to understand. Emily reached into a drawer and removed a notebook I had never seen before. I started writing in this after we got engaged, she explained. Whenever I worried about our future, I wrote everything down instead of saying it out loud. She handed it to me without hesitation. I slowly turned the pages. They were filled with short reflections, questions, and reminders to herself. Some entries described wedding plans. Others listed financial goals, dreams about starting a family, and ideas for building a life together. One sentence appeared again and again in different forms. Do not let fear become silence. I looked at her with quiet surprise. You kept reminding yourself of this. She nodded. Yes, and somehow I still did exactly the opposite. I gently closed the notebook. Then maybe this is not a story about a legal agreement at all. She tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Maybe it is a story about 2 people who both believe they were protecting the relationship while forgetting that protection begins with honesty. Emily lowered her eyes before quietly answering. I think you are right. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen. I answered and thanked her for the professionalism she had shown the previous evening. She sounded genuinely pleased to hear from me. I was actually calling to check on both of you, she said. Not as your attorney, but as someone who has seen many couples struggle with conversations like this. I appreciated her honesty. We talked for hours after leaving the restaurant. I told her. That is encouraging, she replied. May I offer one final piece of advice? Please, do not measure the success of your relationship by whether you sign a prenuptial agreement. Measure it by whether both of you feel heard before making the decision. After we ended the call, I shared her words with Emily. She smiled thoughtfully. I think she has been trying to tell us that from the beginning. We decided to spend the rest of the afternoon reviewing our financial lives together without legal language or formal documents. We listed our savings, our retirement accounts, our future goals, and the responsibilities we hoped to share after marriage. Some conversations were easy. Others required long pauses and careful listening. Yet none of them felt uncomfortable because they were finally happening together instead of separately. By early evening, the notebook on the table contained more handwritten notes from both of us than the original agreement contained legal clauses. We had crossed out assumptions, added new ideas, and written questions we wanted to revisit later. Looking at those pages, I realized they represented something far more valuable than any contract. They reflected 2 voices working side by side, instead of one person preparing answers alone. Emily gently rested her hand over mine. Thank you for staying, she whispered. There was a moment last night when I thought I had ruined everything. I smiled warmly. You did not ruin everything. We simply discovered a conversation we should have started much sooner. She laughed softly. Then maybe this weekend we should begin a new tradition. What kind of tradition? Whenever one of us feels afraid to bring up an important subject, we promise to talk about it before the fear has time to grow. I nodded without hesitation. That is one agreement I will happily make. As the evening settled around us, the leather folder remained closed on the counter while our handwritten notebook stayed open on the kitchen table. One represented what we almost allowed to define our future. The other represented the future we were beginning to build together, one honest conversation at a time. 3 days later, the leather folder returned to the center of our dining table, but this time it looked very different. It was surrounded by notebooks, financial statements, retirement summaries, and handwritten pages filled with questions we had prepared together. Instead of feeling like evidence in a disagreement, the table looked like two people planning a future with equal voices. Emily poured fresh coffee into both mugs before sitting beside me instead of across from me. That small decision said more than either of us realized. We were no longer approaching the conversation from opposite sides. We were working from the same side of the table. Right on time, Rebecca arrived carrying only a slim portfolio instead of the heavy briefcase she had brought to the restaurant. She smiled as she noticed the handwritten notes spread across the table. "I have to admit," she said warmly, "this is exactly what I hoped to see." Emily laughed quietly. "It took us a dramatic dinner to figure it out." Rebecca smiled. "Sometimes difficult beginnings create healthier endings." She sat down and carefully opened the original agreement. "Before we discuss any legal language," she said, "I would like each of you to answer one simple question. What do you want this agreement to protect?" Emily answered first. "I wanted to protect our relationship from misunderstandings about money." Rebecca nodded before looking at me. "Daniel," I thought for a moment before answering. "I wanted to protect our ability to trust each other, even if our financial lives become more complicated in the future." Rebecca smiled. "Those answers are much closer than either of you probably realizes." She began reviewing each section one page at a time. Instead of reading long legal explanations, she asked questions. "Does this clause reflect both of your intentions? Would either of you feel uncomfortable living with this decision 10 years from now? Is this protecting fairness or creating unnecessary distance?" Every question forced us to think beyond legal wording. Some sections remained almost unchanged because we both agreed they were practical and balanced. Others were completely rewritten after honest discussion. The arbitration clause was removed immediately. Several paragraphs about future business ownership were revised so that transparency and mutual disclosure became more important than rigid separation. One section about inherited property stayed because we both believed family inheritances should remain personal unless freely shared. Every change happened through conversation instead of assumption. At one point, Rebecca quietly closed the folder and looked at both of us. "Do you notice something?" Emily smiled. "We have been talking for almost 3 hours." Rebecca nodded. "And neither of you has raised your voice once." I laughed softly. "Because we are finally discussing the same problem instead of defending different assumptions." Emily reached for my hand beneath the table. "I wish we had done this months ago." "So do I admitted. "But perhaps we would not have appreciated the conversation as much if we had not first experienced the mistake." Rebecca carefully printed a revised draft from her laptop and placed it in front of us. The document looked familiar, yet somehow completely different. It no longer felt like something written for one person and presented to another. It reflected countless shared decisions made over several honest conversations. Emily slowly turned through the pages before looking at me. "This finally feels like us." I agreed. Not because every clause is perfect, but because every page contains both of our voices. Rebecca gathered the earlier drafts into a separate folder. "I recommend keeping these," she said. Emily looked surprised. "Why?" "Because one day you may want to remember how much you both learned before reaching this version." I looked at the original draft that had nearly divided us during an expensive dinner only a few days earlier. It no longer represented embarrassment or disappointment. Instead, it reminded me that relationships are rarely tested by easy conversations. They are strengthened by the difficult ones people choose not to avoid. As Rebecca prepared to leave, she paused at the front door. "Whatever decision you make about signing," she said sincerely, "I already consider today a success." Emily smiled with quiet gratitude. "Because of the agreement?" Rebecca gently shook her head. "Because today you acted like partners long before acting like clients." After she left, Emily leaned against my shoulder as we looked at the revised document resting quietly on the table. Neither of us reached for a pen. We both understood that one final decision still remained, and for the first time since that unforgettable dinner, we were completely ready to make it together. The following Saturday morning, Emily and I returned to Rebecca's office carrying the revised agreement we had shaped together over several days of honest conversations. The atmosphere could not have been more different from the evening we first met inside the restaurant. There was no audience waiting for a reaction, no applause, no surprise, and no pressure to decide before either of us felt ready. We sat side by side instead of across from each other. Rebecca reviewed the final draft one last time, carefully confirming that every revision reflected decisions we had made together. "Do either of you have any remaining questions?" she asked. Emily looked at me before answering. "No, because every question has already been discussed." I nodded in agreement. The document is no longer explaining our future to us. It is reflecting the future we already chose. Rebecca smiled warmly. That is exactly how this process is supposed to work. She placed 2 pins on the conference table, but made no effort to slide them toward us. The decision belonged entirely to us. Emily reached for my hand before either of us touched the agreement. "I owe you one more apology," she said quietly. "Not because I wanted a prenuptial agreement, but because I forgot that trust cannot begin after paperwork. It has to exist before the paperwork ever appears." I gently squeezed her hand. "And I owe you something as well." She looked surprised. "What?" "I should have asked more questions whenever I noticed you becoming anxious about wedding planning. I kept assuming everything was fine because I believed love would automatically solve difficult conversations. It does not. People solve difficult conversations by choosing to have them." Rebecca remained silent, allowing the moment to belong entirely to us. We looked through the document one final time. Every clause now reflected shared decisions instead of assumptions. Every page reminded us of a conversation that had strengthened our relationship rather than weakened it. Together, we signed the agreement with complete confidence, not because anyone expected us to, but because we both understood every word and every intention behind it. Rebecca notarized the signatures, closed the folder, and handed each of us a copy. "Congratulations," she said sincerely. Emily laughed softly. "Most people probably expect congratulations after a wedding." Rebecca smiled. "Today I am congratulating you for learning how to communicate before the wedding." We thanked her and stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunshine. As we walked toward the parking garage, Emily stopped and looked at me with the same smile that first made me fall in love with her. "Can I ask you one last question?" she said. "Anything. If you could go back to that expensive dinner, would you change what happened?" I thought carefully before answering. I would change how it started, but I would never erase what we learned because of it. She nodded slowly. Neither would I. A few months later, surrounded by family and close friends, we exchanged wedding vows in a small ceremony overlooking Lake Michigan. There were no unexpected speeches, no legal surprises, and no hidden conversations waiting for another day. Everything important had already been discussed long before we stood together at the altar. Looking back now, I rarely think about the restaurant, the applause, or even the agreement itself. What stays with me is something much simpler. Healthy relationships are not built because 2 people never face uncomfortable moments. They are built because 2 people choose honesty before assumptions, conversation before silence, and partnership before pride. Every time someone asks me whether I believe prenuptial agreements are good or bad, I always give the same answer. A document is never what determines the strength of a marriage. The conversations that happen before anyone signs, it always matter far more than the signatures themselves. That unforgettable evening taught me that trust is not created by avoiding difficult subjects or by pretending fear does not exist. Trust grows every time 2 people decide that understanding each other is more important than winning an argument. In the end, that lesson became the strongest promise Emily and I ever made. And unlike the ink on any page, it continues to guide our marriage every single day.